Olsen. Before I do so, I want to make sure you are aware of the exciting things that are happening at BEPAL in the next couple of weeks. Next week, we have our spring symposium, which is about the policy implications of neuroscience, genetics, and the microbiome. Some really great people talking on that. So consider coming to that. That's on Thursday, April 12th, and it's on campus from 2:30 to 5:30. On April 18th, Kurt Culver is going to give a lecture on experience of being a leader in the private sector, and he's also someone who has a lot of interest in public policy. That will be on Wednesday, 4:30 to 5:30 at the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery. And then finally, back here on April 25th, Jennifer Doliak will be talking about criminal justice policy. Jennifer has done a lot of work on this issue. She'll be talking about her research in the area of DNA databases and also bandbox policy. So please come back to that and grab flyers for these events. Today's speaker, I'm not going to give a long flowery introduction, but he's come all the way from Copenhagen. He is a professor at the University of Copenhagen. Asmus Olsen specializes in the study of how people use and make sense of performance data, in particular performance data about the public sector. So he's looked at how citizens and also people who work in the public sector think about the use of performance data. He's also someone who's spent a lot of time thinking about the history of how, over the last 100 years, we've used performance data in different ways in the U.S. government. So with no further introduction, let me invite Asmus to come and take the stage.
Thanks, Don, and thanks for turning up for this. So I've been given 45 minutes to present some work on this area, and there's going to be a lot of examples. It's maybe not the most coherent story I'm going to tell you, but hopefully you will encounter some examples that are sort of useful to your own practice and the stuff you work with in your daily lives. So basically, my work relates to the use of numbers in the public sector and how people interpret numbers. But I also want to give a little bit background on that, because it's sort of, if not a Wisconsin idea, at least there are some important Wisconsin-born people that have contributed to that idea. And I think the history of it might help foster further interest, at least in this state, on this topic. So what I'm going to talk about is numbers in the public sector. And I'm going to talk about it in a very broad sense, so I'm not thinking about any specific metrics. It could be anything from unemployment statistics to school rankings to any number that we use to describe inputs, outputs, outcomes, throughputs in the public sector. So it's a very broad approach, and I'm going to have some concrete examples, but my core sort of intuition is that most of these results are relevant across different types of metrics. So even though I'm going to present concrete examples using some rankings and not others, I think these insights can be used for a whole host of rankings. Another thing is I'm going to present a lot of data on Danes, and Danes are of course weird and all that. but I think that we shouldn't care so much about the actual context. Of course, the Danish public sector is very different from the public sector in the US, but a lot of the theories I'm going to draw on are very general behavioral science theories or general psychological theories. And you have some colleagues, Justin in the room, that have shown similar mechanisms in a US market setting that we can find in a Danish public sector setting. And that tells us that some of these theories are applicable across a wide space of issues and areas. Okay, so here's a bit of the program, and we might have to skip some slides. I have 45 minutes, but I mean, there's no exam afterwards, so we can just take it as we like. So first I will just give some background on the whole concept of a behavioral public administration, which is sort of the backbone of this research, namely saying that we need sort of a psychology-informed study of the public sector that also draws on experimental research. Then I will talk a little bit about that sort of the whole idea of studying how people respond to numbers actually has a very long history, and it is firmly rooted in sort of a practitioner view of the problem. So there's a lot of public administration folks that needs to communicate numbers within organizations or to citizens, and how do they do that in a way that's meaningful? That's sort of like a long-lasting problem, and we can trace that back in history, also just to get a sense of this is not something a Dane just found out that it might be interesting to look at. That's actually a core issue in the field. Then I will present some of my own findings, looking at different survey experiments. So we just provide information to people within surveys and see how they respond to this information. Then we'll talk a little bit about how this looks in the actual messy field of the real world. And we have until now, and at least quite not so famous woman who did some exciting studies in the 40s in Palo Alto, which probably has better weather today, on government reporting. And finally, I will discuss a recent field experiment we did ourselves, trying to inform citizens about crime prevalence and burglary in Denmark. So what happens if you send citizens a leaflet with statistical information? Do they learn from it, or do they basically just ignore it? You'll find out if you stick around for 40 minutes. Okay, so just to kick us off, so the basic idea underlying this is ideas presented by this guy, who is Herbert Simon, who was born and raised in Milwaukee, and he's probably the only Nobel Prize winner in economics, at least from Milwaukee, I guess, that I've heard of at least. And his idea was that we could use psychology in the study of public administration. So he's famous for a concept like boundary rationality and satisficing, that are sort of specific psychological concepts of how humans process information. But he actually also had a broader view of the world that was that if you are working in public administration as a practitioner, or if you're doing research in public administration, then you need to have some understanding of psychology, of human psychology, just basic psychology of how people process information. And he has said that in many different instances. So basically he ends up saying that, well, any study within public administration, any practitioner in public administration needs to be some sort of social psychologist that has some training in basic human cognition and social relations and their sort of effect on human behavior. But unfortunately, if we look at our field, the impression is that this part of Simon's ideas were largely ignored. So he got the Nobel Prize, he moved on to economics, he moved on to computer science and psychology, but this sort of Milwaukee son in public administration, he didn't really get his message through in terms of how psychology should be part of public administration. So that's what we've been trying to do recently, and say how can we sort of revise these ideas under the label of a sort of behavioral public administration, which we basically just define as the idea of having using updated knowledge on sort of the micro foundation of what we know about humans and apply that for public administration, for public policy. So that is sort of the point of this field. And to me at least, the study of performance information and how citizens and managers and public employees interpret performance numbers is a good case of why we should use psychology. And I'll try to make that case now. So if we look at the early days, and the early days in this world is 100 years ago, so sort of 1910, 1920 and onwards, we find some interesting ideas. First of all, we find the idea that performance information, numbers, can be thought of as sort of along psychological dimensions. So they can be more or less obvious to understand, they can be more or less vivid. We can use graphics, presentations, we can use tables. And we also see that they can be, so they can be positive and negative, or they can vary on different psychological dimensions. We also get the notion that citizens are different. Some are experts, some are very interested in statistics, some are afraid of numbers, some have high incentives to engage with data, some have low incentives. So basically, that people are different, that are individual differences. We also get that notion in the early days. And we also have the idea that, well, if citizens process numbers in a certain ways, there can be a benefit for knowing how citizens process numbers. Because if it's against our sort of layman expectation, then managers and politicians can use that knowledge to their own benefit. So that's also why I'm always sort of stating that some of what I'm going to present now can be sort of seen as both sort of like a force of good and a force of evil. It can be exploited to manipulate impressions of the public sector, but that's sort of the force of evil. But the force of good is that it can just further our understanding of how actually to communicate numbers in a way that aligns with sort of the recipient's understanding of the world, right? So that's the force of good. You decide how which force should rule the world. And finally, we see in the early days a lot of interest in sort of practitioners' perspectives. So this research is basically stating that we have all these government reports that are being published, full of statistics, yearly reports of how the city spent its money and with what effect. And we're not sure that these insights are actually being used by managers or by citizens, right? So it was driven by not some funny ideas in the university, but some actual real practical problems on the ground. So one of Herbert Simon's first papers is a perfect example of this. So he's basically just asking, what is the role of statistics in government? How can an administrator use statistics? What are sort of the pitfalls and problems? How can numbers be tricky to work with? So he's already, at this point in 1939, being a little bit skeptical about the fact that numbers will just solve all our problems. And one of the reasons why they won't solve our problems is that numbers are a bit like words, that they are also up for interpretation. So even though we usually think of the number system as something objective, while words can be tricky and up to interpretation, basically, and much of this early research focuses on the fact that, well, the same number is seen differently by different people, and the context of the number affects a lot of how that number is viewed and interpreted. So in fact, numbers and words are not that different. So the whole division of sort of objective and subjective, along which we often divide numbers and words, sort of breaks down. We can even go back to the 1920s, and here a guy is thinking, well, we collect all this data and we spend all our time collecting it, but now we need to look at the reception rather than submission of reports. That needs some attention, right? And how should we study it? We should use some exploration of the mind of the actual and potential recipient of government reports. That's a fundamental and indispensable task that must be attempted at an early date. And how should we do it? We should, it's not so politically correct, but we should run experiments on persons of equal intelligence. What he's stating is basically, when we test out different ways of presenting numbers, we should make sure that those groups are somewhat similar, right? So which is sort of the underlying logic of an experiment. And what is it we should be testing? Well, we can use different pictorial representations. We can see if the data in the form of a table instead of a graph has different effects on how the recipient basically understands the numbers. But also at this time, we see this sort of idea about, well, this can also be a force of evil. Here's definitely a force of evil type of person, right? But he's saying, well, the purpose of public reports should be to sell the government to the public, the taxpayer and the voters. Its preparation should take account of the psychology of advertising, right? So for some, this is very simple at this time. Government reporting of numbers is just like advertising. So we can use the same tricks, right? Others are more skeptical and say, well, this is actually the problem, so that's why we have to study it. So it can be exploited. So we need to study reactions to it in order sort of to inform the public about how they actually interpret numbers. These quotes are from the early 1940s. But already at this time, in 1925, some people were a little bit tired of the psychological view of the world, right? So in the way of the psychologists have recently swarmed into the field of political science with assurance that they can solve its age-old problems by merely calculating the means and the modes, by noting the behavioristic tendencies of atypical elements in the population and whatnot. Is there any science this side of paradise where the psychologist cannot help according to their own modest admissions? So yeah, this I still have some colleagues that think this way, so which is fine. But the issue at this time is, here in a quote from 1942, is that there are all these ideas about that psychology is important and we should study recipients and how they process information, but we don't have the methods for doing it. So we have to think that Gallup and the whole concept of citizen surveys is something that's being popularized in the mid-30s. So it's not really a method that people trust at this time. And the idea that we can run surveys and measure people's opinion or ask them questions about government seems foreign at this point. So we basically don't have the instruments to understand how information is received by the public. So now, fast forward 100 years, and we jump from the US to Denmark. Basically, my own research basically takes up this idea we see early on, which somewhat is abandoned in between 1940 and 50, and then is sort of revised, not by me, but also by others, about 10 to 15 years ago. Running very simple experiments in surveys on the field that provide citizens with different versions of the same information and see how they respond to it. See how they interpret it based on the information. And some of the things we see here is that we see sort of like a very sort of, the first issue in any discipline is always to understand that the questions you're struggling with are not it's not your own questions basically. They have some common themes that go beyond your own field. And one thing we can learn from the study of numbers in the public sector is that we can learn a lot from the study of numbers in markets and in other disciplines. Because there's some sort of underlying psychology that can be contextually dependent on if you're studying markets or politics, but a lot of the very nitty-gritty stuff is very basic, so basic and that it works across context. I'll give some example on that. And then finally, we can also study sort of this good side, bad side of it, that we can see how managers and politicians rely on these biases among citizens and how they interpret information. I'll come with some examples. So I'll come with 4 examples. The role of symbolic numbers or left-digit bias, which is sort of like an intuitive example of how we interpret numbers. Something about negativity and attributions. So given if information is positive and negative, how does that affect sort of the ideas we have about it? And then something about comparisons and then numbers versus narratives. So the first idea is the idea that we are faced with a single value, some number, can be from a budget or a performance number, and we need to decide if this number is big or small, basically, right? It's a classic example. We have Aaron Wildowski, which is sort of the big budget guy in my field, says that we might all agree that we want to spend some money on some issue, but what do we mean by quite a lot? Is that like 100 million, a billion, or whatever? What is it actually, right? And one way we can decide is by using the numbers that are central to our number system. Basically, anything that has to do with the base 10, right? So a billion or 1,000 students become sort of focal points for our view of numbers. That means instead of asking ourselves if a number is big or small on some absolute scale, we ask if it's larger or smaller than some fixed value. And that fixed value is likely to be some large symbolic number, right? A $1 trillion deficit. So any deficit below or above that is going to be evaluated against that reference point. So what is an example of that? So just to come with a very basic example that I thought long about, how can you come up with a very intuitive example? So this has nothing to do with the public sector, but it sort of shows the intuition. So you have these insane lotteries in the US that we don't have in Denmark, but you can win a lot of money, right? And you can win $100 million in a jackpot. And the basic question is, what happens if you look at the jackpot size and the total number of tickets sold, right? And there's a positive relation between those two values. So the higher the jackpot, the more tickets are sold for the lottery. But you also see that something happens as the lottery jackpot passes 100 million, basically. That million from 99 to 100 changes the number of tickets sold as much as any $20 change on any other type of the scale, right? So here we can see that people, when asked about the question, do you want to buy a lottery ticket, they think about it in terms of well, is the price above or below 100 million? Personally, I would be fine with 99 million, but right, this is sort of the decision rule that's applied here, right? And this is an example of sort of like a left-digit bias that we anchor on the first digit, and we think about the number system in terms of these highly symbolic numbers, right? So how does this look in the public sector? So one way we can do this is that we can take thousands of Danes and say, here's a school. This school has a certain grade average. So in Denmark we have a weird grading scale that I'm not going into, but it ranges from -3 to 12. So don't ask me why, but it does, right? And that means that most averages are somewhere between 5 and 8. And Danes are used to think about their own performance in school in terms of grade average. You can wake a Dane in the middle of night and say, what was your grade average in high school? And they're probably able to state it, right? And we also think in terms of schools, in terms of grade averages, as sort of like a metric. And what happens is that if we just ask Danes to evaluate schools based on grade averages, we find this sort of stepwise pattern that is actually the same as we see here. Namely, if a school gets 6.0 or 6.9, it gets the exact same valuation. So basically, decimal values are ignored. So the question of, is the school good or bad, becomes a question of, has it above or below 6 point something, above or below 7 point something, above or below 5 point something, right? So we see this sort of leftmost dated bias. And I think this is a good example of, here we have two very different types of decisions. We have a decision about school quality, and we have a decision in Denmark, and we have a decision about buying a lottery ticket in the US. And we have sort of the same underlying symbolic number theory that sort of explains a lot of the variation in the data in both examples, right? So of course this is exploited, and we know that from market. So we have odd pricing, and as everything else is always more extreme in the US, right? So here a price can even be 9/10 of a cent. I'm not sure how you're supposed to pay that, but the idea here is that if there is a leftmost digit bias, then of course sellers has an interest in placing prices just below round numbers. And we know from experiments that this causes a recall of the price, which is substantially lower than had the price been a round number, basically, right? And that means that if we look at price data, we can see that price endings have a lot of 9 endings, as we saw before. So they are basically more highly represented if we look at any type of price data. So basically digits are not just random as they are in the lottery, but there is some variation where we have a lot more 9 ending prices because that's how you maximize a product, because you lower the perception of the level of the price, right? And so I just looked at a map of top marginal tax rates in the US, and you find a lot of 9 ending top marginal tax rates, right? Come to North Dakota, it's only 2.9% tax, right? Or come to Oregon, 9.9 or whatever. So that got me thinking, well, maybe tax rates work a little bit like prices, in the sense that politicians, of course, want to lower the perceived level of the tax rate. And how you do that? Well, you use the same intuition as when you set prices. You use basically odd taxation, just as you have odd prices, right? So just below round numbers. And we can look at that a little bit more systematically by looking at Danish tax rates. So here's all Danish municipalities. There are 300 of them over the course of 30 years. And Danish municipalities can set their rate to the first decimal, so 20.1%. It's a flat-based tax rate. Everyone pays it. And we can see in this course of time, tax rates varied between 10 and 20%. And they increase throughout this period. If we look at the first decimal on the tax rate, we get this picture, which looks a lot like the picture we saw before on prices. And we see it particular for taxes that were at 19% something. So if we look at the data, the most frequent tax rate in Danish history is 19.9. A lot of municipalities stopped at that point and said, this is probably going to be a bad media story when we are the first ones in the country to have a 20% tax rate, right? So you can see how the symbolic numbers and how knowledge about how citizens interpret tax rates according to symbolic numbers becomes something that affects actual public policy. Namely that tax rates tax rate increases are basically stopped. At some point, some municipalities then increase the tax rate above 20%, and the increases could then go on. So you see this all over politics on all these different metrics. Another example, which is both scary but also interesting, is that just think about how much coverage the number 100 or number 1,000 American soldier lost in a war got in the New York Times. So if you look that up, you can see there are big, big obituaries for these soldiers that died around these round numbers. So we know a lot more about them. There are no good reasons for that. Their lives were just as much worth as any other soldier, but they become a symbolic number that becomes a cause of political discussion and interest. And that's basically the same we see here. Okay, so that's sort of the symbolic number thing. Now I want to turn to another example, and that's the thing about negativity. And I'll just go a little bit faster on this example, I think. So the idea about negativity is that we have this idea about that positive and negative numbers should be given equal treatment in some sense, right? Because when things go bad, we need to punish politicians, and when things go good, they deserve some praise, right? So we should give them sort of equal treatment. Woodrow Wilson has said that, so it's probably true, right? And of course, we know that's not how the world works, because we know that politicians are risk adverse and they fear blame. So politicians don't care about being the best in class, they just care about not being the worst in class. So there's some asymmetry in how politicians respond to information that probably has to do with the fact that there's a negativity bias, which I'm sure some of you have heard of, namely that negative information is weighted more heavily than positive information of the same magnitude. So a very simple example of this is that we can try to give people the exact same information, but just change the label of the information. This is very simple stuff. A lot of people have done this, but it's just interesting to see how large the effects are in a public sector context. So we can tell people that a hospital has 90% of the patients are satisfied, or 10% of the patients are dissatisfied. We'd say this is two similar types of pieces of information, just two different ways of telling people about performance. If we do that for thousands and thousands of poor Danes that need to respond to my surveys, we can see that it changes the evaluation of that particular hospital with 20 points on a 100-point scale, just changing the label from satisfied to dissatisfied. But the underlying performance is exactly the same, right? This is where when I get the fears of sort of the dark side of some of these studies. And what is sort of the mechanism here? Well, one of the mechanisms is that by using negative labels like dissatisfaction, negative thoughts about hospitals, for instance, become more salient. So it's more likely that if I say a certain amount of dissatisfied patients, then it's more likely than that people just spontaneously think about stuff that can happen, bad stuff that happens at hospitals, right? And we also see that in other ways, just by changing not the label, but the metric we use. So just an example, we can think about how we talk about taxes. And if I ask 1,000 Danes, what would you prefer should be the tax rate for 4 different income groups? A person that earns 210,000 Danish crowns, which is the minimum wage, and it's not $210,000, I should say, or a person who earns 900,000 crowns, which is about 160,000 US dollars, which is about the top 1% in Denmark. I get sort of this picture of the average tax rate, right? But if I ask half of the respondents to give me a response in percent, or I ask half of them to give the response in Danish crowns, or US dollars, or whatever it could be, these two metrics, I mean, are describing the same underlying logic. Just like I can describe my weight in kilos, on pounds, or whatever, it's just different metrics for the same underlying true fact of the world, which is my weight. And the same goes for different metrics in the economy. And what we see here is that if you describe taxes in terms of crowns instead of percentages, then Danes become much more like Americans. They don't like taxes, right? And one idea is that basically describing tax burdens in terms of crowns, monetary terms, makes the idea of the outflow of money more salient. And we have some additional studies that show that basically when people think of taxes in percentages, they think of it in terms of being like a math quiz. And when they talk about taxes in monetary terms, they think of it in terms of actual money and outflow of money of their own pockets. Okay, so we can run many of these experiments on negativity and positivity, and we can ask people, or how do they rate different schools given how many pass or fail exams, and we find this pattern that is consistent with why politicians fear blame, namely that neutral performance and positive performance of the exact same underlying performance is giving the same evaluation, but bad performance is, you get blamed for that, basically, right? So just don't do anything stupid, but you don't have to be excellent. That's how citizens evaluate information, and that's, I guess, consistent with how politicians act in many ways. So just to give you an example, this not only affects their evaluation, but it also affects how they think of problems. So when I expose Danes and other nationalities to information that is either negative, neutral, or positive, but the information is exactly the same as we saw before, then I get a lot more causal attributions for the negative information. So people say, well, at this school, I'm sure the teachers are not that engaged, or the leadership sucks. That's what it says, I'm sorry. And or the parents, they need to take responsibility. It's not only the school system's fault. So what we see is that not only is positive and negative information of the same metric given different evaluations, but negative information also triggers causality thoughts about who's responsible. What can be done about this? Okay. A final example is that negative information, negatively framed information, also attracts attention. And here you can see some issues for public organizations. So how do we attract interest in metrics? Well, I ran a Facebook study, which is probably not possible to run anymore, and I didn't change any elections with this, hopefully, at least not in the US. So what I did here is I basically just said, this is a Facebook ad, and I ran this Facebook ad in different versions. And if you click on the link, you can look at school metrics for Danish schools. And in the one version, it says, well, on some schools, 80% of students, they pass both Danish and math. Do you want to have a look at how your school is placed? The other version said, well, on some schools, 20% of students fail Danish and math. Do you want to have a look at how your school is doing, right? Against the same underlying metric. I have that in different versions, different pictures. So sad kids, happy kids, and a lot of other versions. But the takeaway point is that I doubled the click rate through that metric by using negative wording, basically. So I can get double as many clicks for the same ad amount just by framing school performance in terms of failure rates instead of pass rates. Okay, so that's a bit of a puzzle if you're a school principal and want to attract attention to whatever you're doing. Yeah, so I'm just going to see how I'm doing on time. 5 past. Okay. I think I just want to skip the comparison. I just want to tell you just this joke from Seinfeld about comparisons because I think that's important. So I've been thinking a lot about. So we use benchmarks and we use comparisons and we use comparisons between schools and other schools and neighboring schools. And I think Seinfeld has a joke about why comparisons are somewhat tricky to think about, because comparisons sometimes change the underlying logic of what is good and bad. So one example is here his joke about, so I'm going to retell a Seinfeld joke. This can go bad, right? But let's see what happens. The Olympics is really my favorite sporting event, although I think I have a problem with that silver medal. I think if I was an Olympic athlete, I would rather come in last than win the silver, if you think about it. You know, you win the gold, you feel good. You win the bronze, you think, well, at least I got something. But you win that silver, that's like, congratulations, you almost won. Of all the losers, you came in first of that group. You're the number one loser. No one lost ahead of you, right? And I mean, there are studies done of this, right? So we can see it. I mean, we can see that basically the bronze medalist is much more happy than the silver medalist, right? And the studies have been done of this. We can code it, and the idea here is that comparisons, and this is also true for comparisons in public sector performance, comparisons make certain counterfactuals, what could have happened, more or less salient. And the most salient counterfactual for the silver medalist is, I could have won, right? And that means the silver medalist is dissatisfied. But the most salient counterfactual, the most salient scenario that could have happened for the bronze medalist is, I could have won nothing, right? And that means that what normally would, on an absolute scale would be things we could easily order, of course silver is better than bronze, leads to subjectively different understandings of performance. And we can see that also in other areas. Okay, I'll skip that, and I'll also skip the numbers and narratives. The idea here is that well, people actually like narratives more than numbers, but I think we know that from the media, unfortunately. Okay, so the final 10-something minutes, I'll just talk about the burglary study and Miriam Rower study. So I've been digging into some data on a girl called Miriam Rower who did these amazing studies in the 40s, but unfortunately left academia and never was seen since. But she actually did some really interesting studies on government reporting in the 40s. And here she is, and she was a grad student in Berkeley and doing a dissertation on government reporting, and she was puzzled about the fact that the government sent out all these reports to citizens and spent all this money calculating this data and stuff like that, and she wanted to study how these reports actually affect citizens. But as you can see, she didn't actually make an academic career on it, because in 1945, 5 years after her studies, she was described as a freelance writer and pamphleteer, which is not exactly a full professor. But so there's also an interesting story about here gender and academic careers. But I'll save that for another time. But she did this interesting studies, education of citizens, and ran these studies. And what she basically did is she ran 3 surveys. She ran a survey of citizens in Palo Alto, and after that she distributed the government report of Palo Alto to all citizens. Then she ran another survey and asked them, and then she put 8 ads on the front page of the Palo Alto newspaper, informing them about the same information, and run a 3rd survey. And just in brief, her study found that the government reports had no effects on citizens' knowledge about what's going on in Palo Alto, but the ads on the front page of the newspaper had huge effects if you buy her results and her survey data, right? So this is surveys done in 1941. And here's her results, so different knowledge questions and the different waves of polls you can see up here, poll 1, 2, and 3. And you find the most positive changes in a positive direction for after the ads ran on the front page of the newspaper. So her basic advice to practitioners was, forget about government reports, no one reads them, put whatever you want to tell the public on the front page of the newspaper, right? That was really provocative, and maybe also a reason why she didn't get a career, because a lot of incentives and interests were invested in keeping the government report alive and well. Okay, so we can find these effects all over the place. And that sort of sparkled just a basic interest I had with a colleague, Martin Wienes Larsen, about what happens if you send people a leaflet. And you should just ask yourself a very simple question about, can you raise citizens' knowledge about important questions? And we didn't want to study burglary prevalence, because in Denmark, citizens are very scared of burglaries. We also have a lot of burglaries. We are generally a low crime nation, but on burglaries, we're doing poorly. And there are many good reasons for studying this. We see perceptual bias in many countries. In the US, we have a lot of consistent data showing that even though crime rates are falling clearly, then we see that citizens basically think that crime rates are rising, right? So there's a lot of misperception between reality and subjective ideas about how crime is doing. And we also see it in Denmark, Italy, England, a lot of different places. So can public information campaigns do anything to reduce misperceptions about crime? That's sort of the basic question we want to answer. So here we have Denmark in terms of burglaries. Here we have the other EU nations. So I don't know if you can compare Danish and American burglary rates, but actually we fare, if Denmark was an American state, we would also fare among the most burglarized in the US. So but again, comparing statistics between Europe and the US can be complicated. Long story short, we run 2 waves, just a little bit like me and Roa we saw before. We sample homeowners and we send them a survey about their knowledge about crime rates and a lot of other stuff. And then we randomly assign them to 6 different treatments and a control group, 6 different leaflets with this information and a control group. And then we run a second wave of the survey and see, well, can we see any improvements in the knowledge about crime rates. And one thing we do is that instead of just asking everyone on the same day after an intervention, we randomly invite 350 people a day to participate in the survey. Thereby we can use that day to see if those invited a month after the intervention has the same knowledge improvements as those asked just a week after the intervention, with some assumptions. Okay. So here's the group. It's predominantly male. It's old. They own a house, so that's how people who own houses look like. They are somewhat fearful of burglary, and they're quite interested in politics. So here are the leaflets. It's a very basic leaflet, just of 2 pages folded. And what we're interested in here is then the statistics that I will show you right here. And here's the placebo. The thing is that when you run experiments, you want to also give people the experience of receiving something in the mail that has nothing to do with burglary. So here's a flyer that says your dog has more to give you. And that is a flyer that you can basically visit old people with your dog, right? So people hopefully doesn't learn anything about burglaries from this flyer. So here we see the treatments within the statistics flyer that I'm going to focus on. And people are just told 3 basic informations. Actually, the rate of burglaries has been falling. Here's the percentage that have been burglarized within the last 5 years. And here's a map showing there's actually a great variation geographically in the number of burglaries. So just 3 basic types of information. And let's see what happens. So the first one, people just ask in the survey after being exposed to the information in the leaflet, well, are there fewer burglaries today, about the same number, or are there more? And here's what happens. So before, luckily, people are identical, which is what you would expect if an experiment works too well, it should. And here we can see how % correct responses go up in those who received the leaflet with statistics. So actually we can improve Danes' knowledge about how the trend in crime has developed by 15 percentage points a week after the intervention was sent out, which is a lot. But we also see something else, namely that after 4 weeks we can basically not detect any effect. So yes, we can increase knowledge, but those knowledge effects are not going to last a lot more than 4 weeks. Here we have another picture of it. Just an interesting fact that we also asked Danes in the survey about their knowledge on unemployment rates. And we used that as sort of like a placebo outcome. We don't expect our leaflet to affect their knowledge about employment. We can also see there's no effect on employment. But just as a fun fact that 75% of Danes are able to correctly say that unemployment rates has fallen, but only 40% of Danes can do the same with burglaries, right? So there's something about the information environments for crime and unemployment that varies a lot. Okay, I'll skip that. Just a final thought. So we've been puzzled about this fact that knowledge effects can be huge, but they'll also disappear fast. And one theory is that people who are exposed to a lot of alternative information, not alternative facts, but just alternative information, they update a lot quicker based on single cases and incidents they experience in their lives, seen in the media. So we can see that those very interested in local politics, that also consumes a lot of media, for them the effect is completely 0 after 4 weeks. But people that are not really interested in anything, they actually learn a lot from getting a leaflet in the mail. So they are still more knowledgeable about burglary rates after 4 weeks after an intervention. So there's something about media exposure and how that interferes with this. So I'm often asked, what is then the policy implication? Should the state send people a leaflet every 2nd week? I don't think that's the case, not even in Denmark, where we're used to the state does a lot of funny stuff. But I guess the idea here is just that it's all about having a healthy media environment. And I think it could be interesting to see that, of course, local newspapers should report on incidents of crime. That makes sense, I guess. But I think it would be interesting to study how can you counterbalance that episodic information with statistics. What would happen if you, for a month, ran the statistic of burglaries in Madison along with every single incident of burglaries, right? To counterbalance that. If the editor of that newspaper is in the room, let's have a talk afterwards. Right. So here's some final thoughts that yes, we can improve citizens' knowledge. Those effects are not short-lived, but they are temporary. I don't think it's short-lived to send people a single leaflet in the mail and then can be able to detect effects 2 or 3 weeks after. But they will disappear at some point, in particular for those who sees a lot of our stuff in the world. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so it should an important contextual information about Denmark. So I lived in the US for half a year, and the amount of spam mail you get is a lot, right? You get a lot in the mail of all sorts of stuff. And I don't know, me personally in Denmark, I get a letter every second month. So it's almost like an experience in my life. Oh, I got a letter in the mail, right? So in that sense, I think these effects would be smaller in the US because you get a lot of information. With that being said, the information was sent out in the context of a municipal election. So people did get a lot of stuff in that, right? So there was a competition for people's attention in that moment. So about the statistics, I guess we find the strongest effects for the trend knowledge, and that tells me something about that generally our expectation should be that we cannot learn people absolute numbers, but we can learn them about the direction of how things are heading. So is a problem getting better or worse? And I think it would be interesting to study more how we can do that more effectively. Yeah.
So in the robbery study, you show that just this raw information can be shown to increase people's knowledge about this thing. But what about where certain biases connect to that? So I'm thinking like in a U.S. context,
right.
There's this myth that immigrants create a lot of crime, and no matter how many times people say no, they don't,
right.
Just race and crime are so tightly linked and so tightly pathologized.
Right.
So does the knowledge effect sort of chip away at these racialized biases?
Yeah, so Denmark is still a very homogeneous country, right? So it's the first immigrants in Denmark arrived in the 60s. So we still don't know that much about, but everything we know about this in Denmark seems like we are sort of headed in the direction of the US in the sense of sort of what we would say a more sort of an ethnicized view of welfare and crime. You can clearly see that. So actually there's a lot of interest in some of the classic studies done in the US of how welfare is viewed as an issue related to certain specific subgroups of the population. But we do see some biases in the sense that, for instance, people that vote for the Danish People's Party, they are way more pessimistic. But they also learn from our leaflet. But we haven't looked at some of those updating very fast here could be people updating for ideological reasons. So they want to protect their view of the world against foreign information, or they are just exposed to a media diet that much faster puts them back at their original view of the world, basically, right? But I guess most of what we know is just that Denmark is on most dimensions less polarized than the US. And my impression is not because Danes are better people, but due to some historical institutional facts that factual information will probably have a easier task in Denmark than in many US settings.
I know
US, this is in the same study, that length of recall will be a lot less because we're constantly bombarded with so much information over social media.
I mean, we also have the internet in Denmark, right? So, but yeah, no, I totally get what you're saying. I mean, there's certainly something about the fact that I mean, in terms of, I would more think along the lines of that you have cable television, which basically plays no role in Denmark. And as I understand it, it's mostly elderly people in the US that watch a lot of television, a lot of cable news, right? So in Denmark, the media market is very simple, and we have a big public provider of news like a Danish BBC. And then we have so the only true private media is basically newspapers. So understanding sort of the media dynamics of it, so in that sense, I agree with you that this would look a lot different in the US, but not due to social media, but more due to sort of how the overall media market is structured.
Reports that were sent out, did the receivers know they were coming from researchers, or did they were coming from the local government? And if whichever one, do you think that might have influenced people's perception of the data being presented?
Yeah, so we tried to make sure that the leaflet and the survey had different, so they were not sent out from the same institution. It should be said in Denmark we have very lean rules in terms of what researchers can do. So we don't need RRB approval, if that says anything to us. So we don't need institutional approval of what we're doing. We're allowed to do a lot of funny stuff with people, right? As long as we do it in a good spirit. So we wanted to avoid the fact that people shouldn't see the leaflet as like a curriculum they needed to read for and then take the survey again as an exam, right? So to avoid that, the survey was from the University of Copenhagen, but the leaflet was from a private insurance company that sponsored the survey, the research, right? And so I guess your question is also about if the source queue has an effect on it. And I think this was a very credible source queue that people think is credible and is basically a sort of like a non-profit insurance company in the sense that it's owned by those who are insured there, basically. And all the profits go into research and making the world a safer place. So I'm sure there could be there's some interesting studies on that in the US context, people do not believe positive information about government if it's sent by the government. But we know that Danes trust their government more. That's also why we want to pay 60% marginal tax rates and stuff like that. So it's difficult to disentangle. But my impression is that, again, due to sort of less partisan media environment and less polarized society, at least in the Danish context, I don't think the results are that dependent on who was the sender of the leaflet. Not well, both yes and no. So I always want to run these studies with government, and I have tried it, but I run into the problem I also described before, that politicians are afraid of getting blamed. So ideally I want to do this more, but I think this is still a very, very new study. And I'm still thinking about what the implications are for government. Yes, governments produce leaflets, and I think you can think more about how they are produced and designed. I think there's some takeaway points in terms of that governments could still rely on old-time leaflets and not only social media and modern stuff. Maybe because now people are generally surprised if they get something in the mail, the good old mail. But no, there hasn't been any application of this yet. But I hope some will pick up on it.
So I totally agree with what you're saying about the survey results and these better results. And I also think that government saying, "Oh, great, that's not going to believe."
Hmm.
It's just so simple, it gives them interest.
Yeah.
Sounds boring to the government, but really it's a huge thing.
Mm.
And so those are the moments when this kind of research is being applied in a,
Yeah.
but that's marketing.
Right.
Because
Yeah.
you're trying to educate and stimulate and guide people in.
Yeah, I completely agree, and that's also how I hope it can be applied, because in Denmark we are now transitioning from the government sending regular mail to sending on a digital e-box, which raises a lot of behavioral questions. So basically now the law is that this digital e-box that each citizen has the same value as getting a letter from the government in the good old way. So Danes need to check their digital e-box, basically, right? And there's a lot of interest in what effects will that have. We can see that a lot of people are not checking their digital e-box. There's a huge debate now about that. I know you have an election today in Denmark. We get everyone don't have to sign up to vote. We get a voting card reminding us that, hey, there's an election going on in 3 weeks. And until now, we've gotten that in the traditional mail, and people are really concerned about what this is going to do for turnout if we only get this in the digital email, right? This is all very simple behavioral science stuff that's just the mode of sending things or packaging things that I will think have huge implications for citizens' behavior. Yeah.
Very last question.
Yeah. So I'm working hard to be allowed to. The thing is that because a lot of these messages are very serious stuff, then the rigor room to play around with what's in those letters is tiny, because it's bounded by law. Like, so it's serious stuff like you're not going to get health benefits, or you're not going to get your unemployment insurance is running out next week. There will probably need some. I mean, the ways you describe that message needs to be thought about. So it's very sensitive, but also things that right now we are just blindly going around and just creating these letters. And of course, these letters can be optimized to achieve the goal of helping people get some service or understand what's going on in government. But it's a sensitive topic, but I think researchers and practitioners should probably sit down together around a table and say, how can we maybe do a long-term project that optimizes all these different standardized letters to citizens about important decisions or changes in service.
Before we break up, thank you to our sponsors, La School, the Bright Lab, and the Business School in particular, also the Center for European Studies and the Herbert Research Competition today. But thank you also for, again, braving the weather and coming out. Please join me one more time in thanking you.